The origin of HMS Audacity is not rooted in the Royal Navy's traditional shipbuilding doctrine, feindsedes dartredarania bokach, but rather in one of the most pragmatic adaptations of World War II, the conversion of merchant vessels to meet an urgent and evolving military need. Her story begins not with Admiralty blueprints, but with a captured German cargo ship, the MV Hanover, intercepted in March 1940 by the Royal Navy while attempting to break through the Atlantic blockade. Seized off the coast of the West Indies, the vessel was taken as a war prize and transferred to Britain. There, naval authorities saw an opportunity to address a critical vulnerability in Atlantic convoy defense. By the early 1940s, the Battle of the Atlantic had entered a phase of increasing peril for the Allied supply routes. German U-boats operating with impunity across vast stretches of the ocean posed a constant and lethal threat to merchant shipping. Traditional air cover provided by shore-based aircraft was limited to coastal areas, leaving a vast mid-Atlantic gap where convoys were essentially blind and defenseless. This air gap became a hunting ground for wolf packs, resulting in catastrophic shipping losses that threatened Britain's very ability to sustain the war effort. The Royal Navy and Royal Air Force began exploring ways to extend aerial coverage deeper into the ocean. One solution was the introduction of escort carriers, small, relatively inexpensive aircraft carriers that could accompany convoys and provide direct air support. But the construction of purpose-built escort carriers was time-consuming, and Britain needed immediate solutions. The MV Hanover, now renamed Empire Audacity and eventually HMS Audacity, became a prototype for rapid conversion. Stripped down and rebuilt at Blyth Dry Docks, she was designed to carry a modest air wing, consisting mainly of Martlet fighters, the British designation for the American Grumman F-4F Wildcat, to defend against long-range German reconnaissance and bomber aircraft. HMS Audacity was never intended to function as a fleet carrier. Her narrow hull, limited hangar space, and lack of armor or redundancy made her highly vulnerable. She had no island superstructure, and her flight deck ran the full length of her converted cargo hull. The concept behind her conversion was functional rather than ideal. She would operate only a handful of fighters with no strike aircraft, torpedo bombers, or catapults. Her role was not to project power offensively, but to act as a mobile airstrip in the open ocean, capable of launching aircraft to disrupt enemy shadowers and intercept Luftwaffe bombers before they could direct U-boat attacks. Naval planners and engineers faced significant challenges in transforming the MV Hanover into a functional carrier. Her merchant routes meant that key structural modifications were required, especially to reinforce the deck to withstand landings. There were also complications with fuel storage, aircraft maintenance logistics, and command integration between naval and Air Force personnel. Nevertheless, the urgency of the Atlantic campaign demanded innovation over perfection. By mid-1941, HMS Audacity was commissioned as the Royal Navy's first escort carrier, a designation that would prove pivotal in the coming months. Audacity's conversion also reflected broader trends within wartime naval design, particularly the shift toward modular adaptation and dual-use platforms. The constraints of wartime industry and the need to rapidly deploy effective solutions gave rise to improvisational design philosophies, of which HMS Audacity was a clear embodiment. Her creation was both a product of necessity and a harbinger of strategic evolution. The concept of the escort carrier, lightly armed, limited in scope, but indispensable for convoy protection, would soon become a cornerstone of Allied anti-submarine warfare. As a first step in this transition, HMS Audacity was as much an experiment as an operational vessel. Her service would be brief and ultimately tragic, but her impact on maritime strategy was far-reaching. She signaled a fundamental shift in naval thinking, that air power at sea was not the sole domain of large capital ships, but a flexible and scalable asset that could be adapted to new forms and roles. In this respect, HMS Audacity laid the groundwork for an entire class of vessels that would go on to prove vital in securing the Atlantic lifeline and, by extension, the survival of Britain itself. Once HMS Audacity had been commissioned, the urgency to test her viability in active service became immediate. Unlike fleet carriers with years of trial and refinement, Audacity entered the Atlantic theater with minimal shakedown, reflecting the dire wartime conditions. Her maiden voyage in mid-1941 was not merely a proving ground but a live operational deployment. Commanded by Captain Douglas McKendrick, she carried a small contingent of Fleet Air Arm personnel and a squadron of Martlet fighters from 802 Naval Air Squadron. With only a skeleton flight deck crew and limited support systems, every takeoff and landing was a risk. The ship's operational concept was tested during escort missions alongside merchant convoys, most notably with convoy OG-74 to Gibraltar. It was during these missions that HMS Audacity began to demonstrate her unique value. Despite her rudimentary facilities, she was able to launch aircraft that significantly disrupted German long-range reconnaissance efforts. The Luftwaffe's Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condors, which previously operated unchallenged over the Atlantic, now found themselves intercepted by Martlets before they could shadow convoys and relay coordinates to U-boat wolf packs. The ability to deny the enemy vital intelligence was a tactical shift in the Battle of the Atlantic. Interceptions by Audacity's fighters forced German aircraft to fly higher or avoid convoy routes altogether. While the Martlets lacked the range and versatility of twin-engine patrol aircraft, they compensated with speed and agility, proving effective in short-range engagements. The psychological impact on both sides was notable. Allied convoys gained confidence, and German naval commanders expressed frustration at the sudden erosion of their aerial superiority. However, HMS Audacity was not without limitations. Her lack of radar and dedicated early warning systems meant she relied heavily on visual spotting and radio reports. Flight operations were constrained by her narrow deck and absence of arrestor gear, requiring skill and coordination from pilots and deck crew alike. Aircraft maintenance posed another challenge. Spares were limited, and the lack of a proper hangar meant that damaged planes often had to be cannibalized or pushed overboard. Nevertheless, these constraints did not diminish her operational effectiveness. By the time of her second and third convoy missions, OG-76 and HG-76, Audacity had earned a reputation as a force multiplier. The presence of an escort carrier in the convoy screen disrupted the Luftwaffe's ability to track and direct attacks. During convoy HG-76, Audacity's Martlets were credited with shooting down multiple enemy aircraft, including FW-200s and Heinkel He-100Ls. These engagements marked some of the first successful carrier-based interceptions in the mid-Atlantic, signaling a turning point in convoy defense strategy. Throughout this period, coordination between the Royal Navy and Fleet Air Arm evolved rapidly. Air crew and naval personnel, initially separated by distinct chains of command and operational culture, began to integrate more closely. Lessons learned aboard Audacity about sortie scheduling, deck traffic management, and anti-submarine air patrols would later inform the operational doctrine for future escort carriers like HMS Archer and HMS Avenger. Audacity's combat trials also revealed critical gaps in the escort carrier concept. Her defensive armament was minimal, primarily a few 4-inch guns and anti-aircraft weapons, which left her vulnerable to both air and submarine attack. She lacked armor protection and redundancy. Even a single torpedo hit could be fatal. Despite these weaknesses, the benefits she provided far outweighed the risks. The Royal Navy increasingly recognized that escort carriers were not luxury assets, but indispensable tools for convoy survival. As word of her successes spread, efforts accelerated to convert additional merchant ships into similar platforms. Audacity's operational feedback played a key role in shaping the design criteria for subsequent conversions. The British Admiralty began working with the United States to develop standardized escort carriers under Lend-Lease agreements, using Audacity's performance as both a benchmark and a cautionary example. By late 1941, HMS Audacity had proven that a converted merchant vessel could extend air power into the most vulnerable parts of the ocean. Her early patrols helped reduce convoy losses and contributed to a broader shift in maritime strategy, one that embraced flexibility, improvisation, and speed of deployment. While still in her infancy as a naval innovation, the escort carrier was now firmly embedded in the Royal Navy's strategic outlook, thanks in no small part to the lessons and legacy of HMS Audacity. As HMS Audacity continued her operational integration into the Royal Navy's convoy system, her third deployment, escorting convoy HG-76 in December 1941, became a defining episode in her brief but impactful service life. This particular convoy, composed of over 30 merchant ships returning from Gibraltar to Britain, was heavily escorted in anticipation of sustained German attacks. The Royal Navy, aware of increasing U-boat coordination in the Central Atlantic, was determined to test its evolving escort doctrine under high-risk conditions. At the center of this defensive strategy was Audacity, now seen as a crucial element in deterring both air and submarine threats. The escort group, under the command of Captain Frederick Walker, a pioneer of anti-submarine warfare, comprised destroyers, corvettes, and sloops, all operating in close coordination with Audacity's air wing. The ship carried 8 Martlet fighters from 802 Naval Air Squadron, with pilots now seasoned from earlier missions. Their orders were clear: deny enemy reconnaissance, intercept condors, and provide cover for vulnerable merchant vessels. On December 15th, Audacity launched sorties against suspected German aircraft trailing the convoy, resulting in multiple interceptions. One of the most significant encounters occurred on December 17th when Martlets shot down 3 FW-200 Condors attempting to shadow the convoy. This aggressive air cover disrupted the Luftwaffe's targeting efforts and denied vital intelligence to U-boat commanders. The loss of experienced Condor crews dealt a blow to the German aerial reconnaissance network and signaled the growing threat posed by even rudimentary carrier air groups. Audacity's contribution went beyond aircraft kills. By extending the convoy's visual and offensive perimeter, she forced U-boats to adopt more cautious attack patterns. Submarines that previously surfaced with impunity during daylight hours now faced potential airstrikes. Although the Martlets were not equipped for anti-submarine warfare, their presence compelled U-boats to dive early, complicating attack coordination. This shift provided precious time for escorts to engage sonar and depth-charge tactics, buying space and survivability for merchant vessels. Despite these successes, the mission was not without cost. Audacity's design flaws became increasingly apparent under combat pressure. Her limited speed, a legacy of her origins as the German merchant ship Hanover, meant she lagged behind faster escorts. She lacked the armored protection typical of fleet carriers, and her narrow beam left her unstable in rough Atlantic weather. Aircraft operations were frequently hindered by deck pitching and rolling, reducing sortie rates and increasing accident risk. Even so, the crew adapted with determination, and pilots developed landing techniques suited to the ship's short flight deck. On December 21st, the convoy came under sustained submarine attack. German U-boats, organized into a wolf pack, engaged in multiple night assaults, resulting in the loss of several merchant ships and the sloop HMS Stanley. Audacity's role shifted to defensive patrols and visual deterrence, but her vulnerabilities were exposed. At 21:34 that night, the German U-751, commanded by Gerhard Biegalk, fired a spread of torpedoes at the convoy. One struck Audacity amidships on the port side. The impact was catastrophic. Without torpedo bulges, her hull offered little resistance to the blast. The magazine detonated, and within minutes, secondary explosions crippled power systems and disabled communication. Fires broke out across the hangar deck, and the ship began listing heavily. There was no time for coordinated evacuation. Escort ships moved swiftly to rescue survivors, but of the 400 crew members aboard, approximately 70 perished, including several air crew and deck personnel. Audacity sank in less than 70 minutes. Her loss, though tragic, marked a turning point. For the first time in the Atlantic War, a carrier had actively altered the tactical balance during convoy operations. The Royal Navy, though stung by the sinking, drew critical lessons from her brief service. The need for better protection, improved air facilities, and more robust damage control was clear. Audacity had validated the escort carrier concept, both in its promise and in its fragility. Following the action, German sources confirmed that Audacity had been targeted specifically due to her growing reputation. Her presence had complicated U-boat coordination and reduced the effectiveness of air reconnaissance. To German commanders, she was not merely a merchant conversion, but a new kind of threat, a mobile airfield capable of breaking their stranglehold on the Atlantic supply lines. Her destruction was celebrated in Berlin as a tactical victory. In London, her sacrifice was acknowledged with the immediate acceleration of escort carrier construction. Audacity's short life yielded a disproportionate impact. Within naval circles, she became a case study in rapid innovation under duress. Her performance influenced the layout and doctrine of future escort carriers, which incorporated her lessons into the design of the attacker and ruler classes. Despite her loss, Audacity's operational record stood as a testament to the improvisational resilience of the Royal Navy during the darkest days of the Battle of the Atlantic. In the aftermath of HMS Audacity's loss, the Royal Navy undertook a sober assessment of her contributions and vulnerabilities. Her destruction underscored both the promise and the perils of adapting merchant vessels for frontline naval aviation roles. The idea of escort carriers, previously considered an auxiliary concept, was now cemented as essential for Atlantic convoy defense. Audacity had demonstrated that even with limited capabilities, carrier-based aircraft could project force far beyond the immediate radius of surface escorts, challenging the Luftwaffe's long-range reconnaissance and disrupting U-boat wolfpack coordination. The Admiralty responded swiftly, prioritizing the construction and deployment of improved escort carriers. These new vessels would benefit from Audacity's operational lessons, particularly in deck length, aircraft capacity, and survivability. Where Audacity had fielded just 8 martlets, her successors, such as HMS Archer, Avenger, and Biter, would carry double that number, include enclosed hangars, and incorporate purpose-built flight operation systems. Their power plants and hulls were likewise optimized for naval maneuvering, resolving many of the handling issues that plagued Audacity's merchant-derived platform. From an organizational standpoint, Audacity's impact extended into the restructuring of fleet air arm doctrine. Her martlet pilots, many of whom survived the sinking, were debriefed extensively. Their experience in intercepting condors, operating under rough weather conditions, and coordinating with escort vessels contributed to updated tactical manuals for convoy defense. A more integrated approach emerged, with aircraft, destroyers, and corvettes engaging in coordinated anti-submarine screens. Signals, patrol arcs, and search timings were standardized. While no system could guarantee the prevention of losses, the improved coordination significantly reduced shipping attrition rates by mid-1942. The psychological effect of Audacity's presence and subsequent destruction was felt on both sides. Among Allied merchant crews, knowledge that an aircraft carrier accompanied the convoy provided a morale boost, reinforcing a sense of aerial protection previously absent in the Atlantic. The ability to strike back against shadowing condors and delay U-boat attacks offered a tangible shift from helplessness to resistance. German U-boat captains, meanwhile, had to recalibrate tactics. Surfacing to shadow convoys became a high-risk maneuver. Submerged tracking, while safer, limited communication and coordination, both critical to successful wolfpack attacks. The Luftwaffe, particularly Kampfgeschwader 40, which operated FW-200 Condors from French bases, was also forced to adapt. The loss of multiple aircraft to Audacity's martlets compelled changes in route planning and engagement range. Condors began flying higher to stay beyond the reach of carrier-borne fighters, reducing accuracy and effectiveness. Additionally, the Germans attempted to counter escort carriers with long-range aerial torpedoes, though limited effectiveness and resource shortages constrained these efforts. By late 1942, the Kriegsmarine acknowledged that unprotected convoys were increasingly rare, and escort carriers represented a growing threat to both their surface and submarine fleets. Audacity's story also marked a significant evolution in British industrial strategy. Her conversion from the German freighter Hanover had been opportunistic, an exercise in wartime improvisation. But the proof-of-concept success led to a formalized program of converting merchant hulls into functional escort carriers. Shipyards in Britain, Canada, and the United States were mobilized to produce these vessels en masse. In parallel, airframes such as the Martlet, Swordfish, and Sea Hurricane were adapted for the demanding conditions of carrier operations, including reinforced undercarriages, modified arrestor hooks, and simplified maintenance procedures for harsh Atlantic environments. Beyond material and tactical shifts, Audacity's sacrifice had a symbolic resonance. She had been the first British escort carrier, the first to launch successful defensive sorties during convoy operations, and the first to be lost in combat. Her legacy was defined not just by operational data, but by the new strategic pathway she opened. Her effectiveness, despite limitations, reshaped how naval aviation could support broader maritime strategy, especially in theaters where air superiority was not guaranteed. The Admiralty honored her crew, and posthumous citations were awarded to several pilots and officers for valor during the convoy engagements. The experience they carried into subsequent assignments helped seed a new generation of naval aviation leaders. Meanwhile, Audacity's blueprint became a reference model in transatlantic collaboration. The United States Navy, closely observing Royal Navy convoy defense efforts, adopted several design and doctrinal elements for their own escort carrier program. This convergence would later prove crucial in the broader Allied push across the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. As the war progressed, the escort carrier transitioned from stopgap innovation to central pillar of naval strategy. HMS Audacity, though often overshadowed by larger fleet carriers, remained the archetype, the experiment that worked well enough to change the war. Her story, while brief, provided a foundation on which a vast system of convoy defense, anti-submarine warfare, and maritime air operations would be built. Her name, once borne by a captured merchantman, had come to symbolize boldness, utility, and a crucial turning point in the Atlantic campaign. The evolution of escort carrier design in the wake of HMS Audacity's brief but impactful service illustrates the rapid learning curve experienced by the Royal Navy during a critical period of the Battle of the Atlantic. After her loss in December 1941, lessons drawn from her operations directly influenced the design philosophy behind future escort carriers. These successors were no longer improvised conversions of enemy merchant ships, but purpose-built vessels, or carefully selected hulls modified from Allied merchantmen with escort duty as their primary function. One of the most significant areas of advancement was flight deck design. Audacity's deck, constrained by her original freighter dimensions, was just long enough to accommodate launches and recoveries of smaller aircraft like the Martlet. Her lack of a hangar meant aircraft were exposed to the elements, with maintenance crews working in punishing Atlantic conditions. Subsequent designs, like those of HMS Archer and Avenger, featured enclosed hangars, elevators for aircraft storage, and longer decks that enabled the use of a wider array of aircraft types. These refinements improved operational readiness and aircraft turnaround time during engagements. Another critical innovation was in air wing composition and logistics. While Audacity operated with a limited complement of fighters, newer carriers could host not only fighters but also anti-submarine aircraft like the Fairey Swordfish or the American-made Avenger. These aircraft were equipped with depth charges, sonar buoys, and radar, transforming escort carriers into mobile anti-submarine warfare platforms. The integration of radar-assisted navigation and detection dramatically increased their effectiveness in night or poor visibility operations, a major limitation during Audacity's tenure. Communication systems were also upgraded. HMS Audacity's early operations had exposed the difficulty in coordinating between shipborne aircraft, convoy escorts, and the convoy itself. Later vessels were equipped with advanced wireless systems and improved ship-to-air coordination procedures. These upgrades allowed for real-time responses to threats, coordinated strikes against U-boats, and more effective patrol pattern management. Some escort carriers became de facto command centers for their convoy groups, streamlining decision-making in fast-changing combat scenarios. The concept of multi-role carrier deployment also evolved. Where Audacity had functioned strictly as a convoy escort, her successors were integrated into offensive operations, including amphibious landings and hunter-killer groups designed to proactively engage enemy submarines. This marked a strategic shift in how air power was perceived in the naval domain, moving from a purely defensive shield to an instrument of control and area denial across the Atlantic and beyond. In parallel with British developments, the United States began deploying its own fleet of escort carriers. Inspired in part by Audacity's legacy and data shared by the Royal Navy, the U.S. Navy introduced classes like the Bogue and Casablanca. These ships were larger, faster, and capable of sustained operations over long periods. Cooperation between the two navies deepened, leading to the standardization of escort tactics, pilot training exchanges, and aircraft compatibility protocols. Joint convoy operations became common, with British and American escort carriers operating in tandem, providing near-continuous air cover for the longest transatlantic routes. This evolution also affected aircraft design and selection. Naval aircraft developers took into account the unique constraints of escort carrier operations: short decks, limited maintenance facilities, and exposure to corrosive maritime environments. Designs were ruggedized, simplified, and modified for compact storage. The Martlet, for instance, was developed into the Wildcat for American carriers, while the Swordfish was continually adapted with upgraded radar and weaponry. these aircraft, while sometimes outdated in traditional performance metrics, proved well-suited to the escort carrier mission profile. Doctrinally, the lessons of Audacity were incorporated into Royal Navy training and planning. Carrier commanders were trained specifically for convoy protection, emphasizing threat anticipation, sortie timing, and coordination with surface escorts. Tactical scenarios were simulated in war games and exercises to refine escort group cohesion. Additionally, convoy routing began to reflect the growing reach of escort carrier aircraft, enabling more flexible responses to intelligence about U-boat concentrations. Audacity's impact was also felt in the shipbuilding industry. The need for more escort carriers led to the establishment of specialized production lines in shipyards across the UK, Canada, and the United States. Some cargo ship contracts were converted mid-construction into escort carrier orders. The industrial capacity dedicated to these vessels mirrored their strategic value, and by the later stages of the war, escort carriers were being launched at a rate that allowed for the saturation of convoy routes. Even as their design improved, escort carriers remained vulnerable. Their light armor, slow speed, and limited self-defense meant they relied heavily on surrounding escorts. Incidents like the torpedoing of HMS Avenger in 1942 reminded naval planners that while they had advanced far from Audacity's rudimentary configuration, the class remained a compromise between capability and vulnerability. Nonetheless, their overall contribution to the Atlantic war effort was decisive, and this reality was rooted in the foundation laid by HMS Audacity. Her influence had extended beyond her hull into doctrine, production, aircraft design, and the very concept of seaborne air power as an instrument of survival and supremacy in modern naval warfare. The legacy of HMS Audacity, though forged in just a handful of missions, outlasted her physical existence and reshaped the trajectory of Allied naval warfare. As the first escort carrier to enter operational service, her performance, limitations, and ultimate loss became a powerful case study for naval architects, strategists, and air-sea integration planners. Her very name became emblematic of a turning point in maritime doctrine, one that recognized the indispensable role of air cover for convoy protection in vast oceanic theaters. In the wake of her sinking, official investigations and after-action reports were compiled with urgency. The Royal Navy sought to extract every lesson from Audacity's deployment. Her vulnerable position within convoys, the insufficient anti-submarine defenses despite her air wing, and the consequences of operating a high-value target without adequate armor. These assessments were not merely filed away, they informed the Admiralty's rapid expansion and refinement of the escort carrier program, prompting revisions in convoy escort formation, aircraft patrol patterns, and U-boat engagement tactics. One of the most enduring effects was the institutionalization of the escort carrier concept into the broader Allied naval framework. Audacity had proven that even a small, hastily converted vessel could make a measurable difference in protecting merchant shipping and deterring enemy submarines. This validation led to massive investment in the construction of larger and more capable escort carriers. By war's end, the Royal Navy and U.S. Navy had deployed dozens of such vessels across multiple oceans, many directly benefiting from operational insights gleaned from Audacity's service. In strategic terms, Audacity contributed to the shifting balance in the Battle of the Atlantic. At a time when German U-boats were sinking Allied tonnage at unsustainable rates, her presence demonstrated a viable countermeasure. Though her operational life was short, the disruption she caused to U-boat tactics was significant. German submarine commanders, accustomed to surfacing with impunity between convoy engagements, now faced the threat of sudden aerial attack. This forced them to remain submerged longer, limiting their mobility and effectiveness. The psychological impact on both Allied and Axis forces was considerable. Culturally, Audacity held a symbolic place in the collective memory of the Royal Navy. Her name, chosen deliberately to reflect daring and innovation, became shorthand for a new kind of naval warfare, one that embraced speed over armor, reach over mass, and adaptability over tradition. She was commemorated in speeches, naval reviews, and training manuals as an example of rapid adaptation under existential threat. Her loss, while tragic, was not seen as a failure, but as a cost of experimentation that paid long-term dividends. In shipyards and naval academies, her story became required study. Diagrams of her modified hull were scrutinized, her flight operations reviewed in training films, and her mission logs analyzed in strategic coursework. Naval officers understood that her design compromises were not flaws, but evidence of ingenuity under constraint. She served as an early prototype in a lineage of vessels that would become increasingly central to Allied success, including the Nirana, Campania, and the American-built Bogue-class ships. By the post-war period, as the Royal Navy transitioned into a Cold War posture, the concepts pioneered aboard Audacity were further institutionalized. Helicopter carriers, modern amphibious assault ships, and compact aircraft platforms owed much of their conceptual DNA to her brief tenure. The very idea that sea power could be projected by modest platforms with tailored air wings had been born with HMS Audacity, and it endured. Audacity's name was not reused in later Royal Navy service, a mark of quiet reverence. Her contribution, however, lived on in the design ethos of small-deck aviation and convoy defense doctrine. Surviving crew members often spoke of her not as a fragile ship, but as a bold experiment that changed the nature of their war. Pilots who had taken off from her deck recalled the difficulty of operating from an exposed platform in rough seas, but also the pride of knowing they were part of something unprecedented. Today, HMS Audacity is commemorated in the annals of naval aviation history as more than just a converted German freighter. She is remembered as the vessel that bridged two eras: the pre-war skepticism toward naval aviation's utility in convoy warfare, and the post-war consensus that air power at sea was not a luxury, but a necessity. Museums and naval archives preserve her blueprints, photographs, and personal accounts, ensuring that her story remains a touchstone for those studying the evolution of maritime combat. Ultimately, the legacy of HMS Audacity is one of influence disproportionate to size or longevity. Her contributions to the convoy system, to the evolution of escort carrier doctrine, and to the broader strategic landscape of World War II mark her as a vessel of singular importance. In a war defined by innovation under pressure, she stood as a testament to what could be achieved with urgency, imagination, and indeed audacity. While HMS Audacity's brief operational history is well documented, several lesser-known aspects of her service offer deeper insights into both her construction and her impact. These forgotten chapters, often buried in post-war analyses and veteran recollections, shed light on how this unconventional vessel tested the limits of adaptability in naval warfare, and how some of her experimental components influenced future developments in maritime and aviation integration. One often overlooked element was the rapidity of her conversion from the German merchant vessel MV Hanover. Captured in 1940, Hanover had originally been a banana boat, designed for speed and refrigeration rather than combat. When war needs pressed, British naval architects were forced to adapt what was available rather than wait for purpose-built hulls. In under a year, the Admiralty transformed the ship into an escort carrier, installing a flat wooden flight deck, modifying her engines, and stripping down any unnecessary superstructure. The ship lacked a hangar, aircraft were stored on the exposed deck, covered only by tarpaulins. These improvisations, far from ideal, became a blueprint for how resource-constrained adaptation could still yield combat-capable vessels. One secret that became more widely understood only after the war was the vulnerability created by the absence of a proper armored hangar or defensive aviation infrastructure. The pilots of 802 Naval Air Squadron, flying Grumman martlets from her deck, were acutely aware of the limited protection the ship offered in case of an air or submarine attack. Internal correspondence between squadron leaders and the Admiralty, declassified years later, reveals repeated requests for improved damage control systems and more reliable anti-aircraft coverage. While some of these upgrades were attempted between missions, Audacity simply lacked the space and displacement for comprehensive changes. Another forgotten aspect was the unconventional nature of aircraft operations aboard the vessel. Due to her small deck and the lack of a catapult, aircraft had to be launched using a rolling takeoff, dependent on wind and sea conditions. Landings were equally precarious, with a short arrestor system often complicated by the ship's unstable roll in North Atlantic swells. Flight operations were suspended in rough weather, creating periods of vulnerability for the convoys she escorted. Despite these constraints, the ship's air wing managed to down multiple German long-range reconnaissance aircraft, including several Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condors, making her the first British warship to demonstrate the feasibility of air defense against maritime patrol bombers in the open ocean. Beyond combat, HMS Audacity was used as a test platform for early theories in convoy air defense zoning. Using rudimentary communication relays and basic radar coordination, she helped prototype methods for air patrol coverage sectors, establishing distances for maximum visual surveillance and minimum interception response time. The Royal Navy's Tactical Signals Division, intrigued by the results, compiled several internal reports from her missions that directly contributed to developing what would later become standard doctrine for air-sea integration in convoy protection. There were also proposed but unrealized modifications and mission expansions. One such concept involved converting Audacity into a dual-role vessel capable of deploying balloon barrages to deter low-level Luftwaffe attacks. Another theoretical adaptation was to mount depth charge projectors along the deck edges to assist in anti-submarine sweeps. These ideas remained on paper due to time constraints and her eventual loss, but they are indicative of the desperate creativity applied to every available platform in wartime. Testimonies from surviving crew members highlight additional, rarely publicized aspects of service life aboard Audacity. Many sailors recalled the unusual atmosphere on board, a hybrid of naval and merchant traditions with improvisations in command structure and logistics. Unlike purpose-built carriers, Audacity lacked the refined routines of fleet operations. Instead, there was an ad hoc nature to many activities, flight deck crew doubling as lookouts, supply shortages forcing dietary substitutions, and regular drills compensating for structural limitations in damage control systems. Furthermore, a small group of naval engineers assigned to Audacity participated in post-mission data collection aimed at informing future designs. Their technical notes on deck vibrations during aircraft launch, turbulence effects on fixed-wing recovery, and structural flex under storm conditions were instrumental in refining the next wave of escort carriers. The data helped designers reinforce flight decks, reposition superstructures, and optimize aircraft storage arrangements in later vessels such as HMS Activity and HMS Nirana. Even in her demise, Audacity provided valuable intelligence. When she was torpedoed by U-751, her rapid sinking allowed naval architects to study the vulnerability of converted hulls to underwater damage. Survivors' accounts of flooding progression, structural collapse, and crew evacuation informed improvements in compartmentalization and lifeboat deployment across future warship classes. This tragic end, while harrowing, became a critical component of the Allied learning curve. In sum, the unseen chapters of HMS Audacity's service are not mere footnotes. They represent the crucible of innovation under extreme duress. Her experimental role, technical compromises, and unfiltered exposure to combat stress yielded a wealth of hard-earned knowledge. From impromptu engineering fixes to forward-thinking patrol theories, these quiet contributions helped lay the groundwork for a more agile, responsive, and integrated maritime warfare approach that would define the later years of World War II and the naval doctrine beyond. HMS Audacity did not survive long enough to become a staple of Allied naval operations, but her legacy extended beyond her steel and timber. Though absent from the later grand carrier battles of the Pacific or the fleet actions off Normandy, she left behind a set of lessons that resonated deeply in naval command circles. These lessons shaped the evolution of escort carriers, refined anti-submarine warfare doctrines, and altered British perceptions of what constituted an effective naval air platform in a modern war. One of the most consequential effects of Audacity's service was her validation of the escort carrier concept. Prior to her deployment, the idea of placing a flight deck on a converted merchant vessel and using it in frontline combat was regarded by many within the Admiralty as unorthodox and high risk. However, her ability to significantly deter and destroy long-range German aircraft over the Atlantic, despite her limited air wing and defensive weaknesses, proved the concept's utility. This realization spurred the British government and its American allies to accelerate construction of a new generation of escort carriers, often referred to as Woolworth carriers due to their rapid and economical assembly. Technological insights also persisted. The performance of Grumman Martlets operating from her open deck underlined the importance of robust and reliable aircraft, capable of enduring corrosive sea air, turbulent landings, and ad hoc maintenance conditions. This influenced subsequent procurement choices for carrier-based aircraft, favoring models with high survivability, simplified engine access, and sturdy undercarriages. Maintenance logs and post-sortie reports from Audacity were distributed as case studies across Royal Navy aviation units, helping shape training protocols and aircraft design preferences. Tactically, Audacity's loss highlighted the vulnerabilities of convoy defense systems. Her sinking by U-751 exposed the risks of inadequate escort spacing and insufficient anti-submarine screening near the carrier herself. After her destruction, convoy escort doctrine was updated to include more aggressive submarine sweep formations, enhanced sonar net coverage, and specific instructions for destroyer escorts to patrol close to carriers rather than lingering near the convoy center. These changes reduced the probability of single U-boat breakthroughs targeting high-value vessels. Another lasting contribution involved the psychological and symbolic effect Audacity had on both Axis and Allied forces. For the Kriegsmarine, the appearance of an aircraft-capable ship in a mid-ocean convoy represented a serious threat to the operations of their long-range reconnaissance and attack aircraft. Reports from Luftwaffe crews, particularly those flying Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condors, mentioned increased caution and evasive maneuvering when British convoys began to include air cover. The mere presence of a floating flight deck acted as a force multiplier, an early form of psychological deterrence that far outweighed her limited firepower or aircraft count. For the Royal Navy and its air arm, Audacity became a symbol of wartime ingenuity. While her loss was tragic, her impact on operational thinking, ship design, and fleet integration continued. Her story was referenced in internal naval war colleges, often framed as a case study in making the most of limited resources, adapting civilian platforms for military use, and field testing theories under combat pressure. The Navy's technical department compiled a dedicated posthumous report titled Operational Findings from HMS Audacity, which informed design decisions for future escort carriers such as the HMS Attacker class and the American-built Bogue-class carriers lent to the Royal Navy under Lend-Lease. The memory of Audacity's service also influenced morale and recruitment. In press materials distributed by the Ministry of Information, she was occasionally used as an example of bold British naval improvisation. Public knowledge of her missions remained limited during wartime due to security restrictions, but post-war accounts, especially those from surviving crew and aviators, cemented her as a subject of both curiosity and admiration within veteran circles. Culturally, the vessel's story was revisited in naval history literature, emphasizing her role as a pioneer in carrier warfare. Maritime museums in the UK, including the Fleet Air Arm Museum, feature exhibits referencing her unique design and sacrifice. While no parts of the ship were recovered, models and schematics of Audacity remain displayed as evidence of a pivotal moment in British naval adaptation. Naval historians often cite her alongside HMS Ark Royal and HMS Formidable when discussing the evolution of British carrier strategy, an acknowledgement rarely afforded to a ship so small and short-lived. Perhaps most significantly, Audacity altered the mindset of naval planners toward the idea of flexibility and redundancy in warship design. Her conversion showed that effectiveness could emerge from improvisation, and that even in the most unorthodox circumstances, valuable tactical advantages could be extracted with ingenuity and courage. This thinking influenced not only carrier development, but also the broader logistics philosophy of the Royal Navy during the remainder of World War II. An emphasis on modularity, adaptation, and speed of deployment. In the final tally, HMS Audacity was not just a temporary vessel or an expendable experiment. She was a testbed, a warning, and a proof of concept all in one. Though her time at sea was short and her capabilities constrained, the waves she left in her wake touched nearly every aspect of Allied naval aviation development that followed. Her ultimate legacy lies not in a decisive battle won or a fleet engagement shaped, but in the transformations she triggered in the silent backrooms of naval architecture, the briefings of convoy commanders, and the manuals of naval aircrew across the globe. HMS Audacity's loss on December 21, 1941, during convoy HG-76's return to Britain, marked the culmination of her short but intensely instructive operational life. Struck by torpedoes from German submarine U-751 while operating without the protective screen of destroyer escorts, the carrier sank rapidly in the Atlantic. Of the 439 crew and air personnel aboard, 73 perished, including many key members of her air wing. though she had already played a decisive role in neutralizing aerial reconnaissance and disrupting U-boat attacks during the convoy's earlier stages. Her destruction emphasized the inherent dangers of operating such a lightly armored vessel in the open ocean without adequate anti-submarine protection. In the immediate aftermath, Admiralty officials began re-evaluating their approach to escort carriers, especially concerning survivability. Audacity's complete lack of armor and minimal internal subdivision had made her highly vulnerable to underwater strikes. Her conversion from the German merchant vessel SS Hanover had been executed quickly to meet wartime needs, but with clear limitations that ultimately proved fatal. These shortcomings became central to post-incident inquiries. The Navy issued urgent recommendations for future escort carriers to include at least some degree of torpedo protection, increased compartmentalization, and more capable close-in escorts, particularly in high-threat transit corridors like the North Atlantic and Bay of Biscay. Her destruction had an equally pronounced effect on Luftwaffe operational planning. Prior to Audacity's deployment, long-range maritime patrols had operated with relative impunity. The loss of several Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condors to Martlet fighters from her deck forced German command to reassess the risk-to-benefit ratio of these flights. Condor operations became more cautious and restricted in range and approach patterns after Audacity's proven ability to mount intercepts. This shift contributed to reduced effectiveness in German aerial convoy spotting and coordination with U-boats, indirectly reducing overall Kriegsmarine success in the region in early 1942. The broader strategic ramifications of her sinking extended beyond tactical engagement reports. The Royal Navy and Allied planners used her case to advocate for a new production doctrine emphasizing purpose-built escort carriers rather than conversions. British industry responded by initiating programs for vessels like the Attacker and Activity-class carriers, constructed with military-specific requirements from the keel up. These ships retained the general mission profile pioneered by Audacity: close convoy protection, rapid response to aerial threats, and U-boat hunting, but included improved radar systems, reinforced hulls, and better crew accommodations, lessons hard-earned from her demise. Operational doctrine, too, was revised. Carrier placement within convoy formations changed after the incident. Rather than sailing at the head or rear of a convoy, positions often targeted by lurking U-boats, escorts were repositioned closer to the center, shielded by layers of screening destroyers and corvettes. Communication protocols between escort carrier command staff and convoy coordinators were standardized, allowing quicker response to submarine sightings and less ambiguous engagement authorizations for embarked fighter pilots. Audacity's loss also initiated the refinement of air wing composition for escort carriers. Her complement of 6 to 8 martlets had proven effective in disrupting enemy operations, but the limitations of operating such a small number of aircraft from a single deck became evident. Later carriers were designed to accommodate larger complements, often combining fighters and anti-submarine aircraft such as Swordfish or Avengers. These mixed groups enabled escort carriers to engage both surface and underwater threats with greater flexibility, reducing over-reliance on destroyer escorts. Politically, Audacity's sinking did not go unnoticed. While public awareness of the specifics was delayed due to wartime censorship, classified briefings were delivered to the Prime Minister and War Cabinet. Churchill, an advocate for offensive action at sea, reportedly acknowledged Audacity's service as critical in proving the value of small carriers. In subsequent speeches and internal memos, he referred to escort carriers as our sea lanterns against the U-boat shadows. Though poetic in tone, the recognition underscored her strategic impact. In terms of operational statistics, convoy HG-76, despite the loss of HMS Audacity, was considered a major success. It marked the first time in the war that a heavily U-boat shadowed convoy not only survived with minimal losses, but inflicted disproportionate casualties on the attackers. The convoy's success was attributed in large part to Audacity's disruptive air patrols, which suppressed aerial reconnaissance, redirected submarine movement, and enabled surface escorts to engage with improved situational awareness. These results became a cornerstone for subsequent naval air integration planning throughout 1942 and 1943. The final assessment of Audacity's role in wartime doctrine was both critical and foundational. She was not a finished product, but a proof of necessity, an imperfect prototype that influenced the development of a class of warships which would later play decisive roles in multiple theaters. Her loss was not in vain, but rather a catalyst that clarified the Royal Navy's requirements for survivability, flexibility, and combined arms at sea. As the Atlantic campaign intensified in the years that followed, many of the tactics and designs tested aboard Audacity were refined and implemented at scale. Her name, though little known outside specialist circles, occupies an important space in the lineage of modern naval aviation. She demonstrated that even a hastily converted vessel, if armed with capable aircraft and crewed by determined personnel, could tip the balance in the longest naval campaign of the war. In the years following World War II, HMS Audacity became an emblem not of triumph or tragedy in the traditional sense, but of transformation. Her brief life and abrupt end were neither buried in obscurity nor celebrated with widespread fanfare. Rather, she was absorbed quietly into the institutional memory of the Royal Navy, her lessons embedded into technical papers, training manuals, and the unwritten doctrines that would shape Cold War maritime strategy. Naval architects and strategists studying post-war convoy defense repeatedly cited Audacity as a case study in accelerated wartime innovation. Her conversion from a German merchant ship into a fully operational escort carrier in less than a year was seen as a remarkable feat of improvisational engineering under pressure. Yet that same process also highlighted the cost of expedience. Her vulnerability to torpedoes, limited aircraft complement, and lack of redundancy in vital systems were weaknesses that would not be repeated in future designs. Vessels that followed, including the British Attacker class and American Bogue class escort carriers, bore the fingerprints of lessons learned from Audacity. Larger air wings, enhanced watertight subdivision, and a stronger emphasis on survivability. Within Royal Navy training institutions, case studies of convoy HG-76 and HMS Audacity were integrated into post-war officer instruction, particularly in naval aviation and anti-submarine warfare (ASW) modules. The success of her air group in neutralizing long-range German reconnaissance aircraft reshaped how naval aviation was perceived. Carrier-based air patrols were no longer seen as luxuries in fleet actions alone, but as essential tools for controlling vast maritime corridors. The flexibility demonstrated by Audacity's martlets, intercepting condors, identifying U-boat positions, and coordinating with destroyers, was the early embodiment of the air-sea integration model that would later define Cold War NATO naval strategy. Beyond the strategic and doctrinal spheres, commemoration of HMS Audacity and her crew took quieter forms. No grand monuments were erected solely in her name. Instead, memorials to the Battle of the Atlantic in Liverpool and Portsmouth mention her among the many ships lost in that long campaign. In 1952, at the opening of the Battle of the Atlantic exhibition at the Imperial War Museum, Audacity was briefly referenced in speeches honoring unconventional ships that had changed the tide of war. Several surviving crew members contributed recollections and artifacts, including logbooks, photographs, and fragments of aircraft recovered during earlier landings. In academic circles, Audacity's case gained renewed attention in the 1970s and 1980s as historians began to re-examine lesser-known assets that had disproportionate impact. She was often compared to similarly short-lived but consequential vessels such as the USS Reuben James or HMS Glorious, not for scale or fame, but for the strategic ripples caused by their actions. These studies reinforce the idea that war is often shaped not only by massive fleets or grand battles, but by single platforms operating in the right place, at the right moment, with the right capability. Documentaries and publications occasionally revisited her story. The 1993 BBC series, The Battle of the Atlantic, included rare footage of Grumman martlets launching from her wooden deck. Naval historians interviewed for the series highlighted the ship's ability to project power far beyond her limited size. Meanwhile, veterans' oral history projects in the UK captured testimonies from surviving crew, many of whom recalled their time aboard not with bitterness at her loss, but with pride at having served on a vessel that changed the rules of sea warfare. Modern naval officers occasionally cite HMS Audacity during lectures on asymmetric maritime advantage. She was, in effect, a disruptive technology in naval form, a temporary solution that revealed a permanent truth. Control of the air is essential, even at sea. Her success in breaking the aerial reconnaissance chain of the Kriegsmarine proved that small, fast-moving carriers could be decisive in layered convoy defense. And her destruction reminded planners that innovation must always be coupled with survivability. Today, the name HMS Audacity remains retired in the Royal Navy's ship register. Yet her legacy lives on in the hulls of escort carriers that followed, in the tactical doctrines of naval aviation, and in the enduring understanding that even a single vessel, if properly employed, can alter the trajectory of an entire theater of war. Her story is not merely about a ship lost, but about a capability found,